broadcasting your inclusion journey online, 18th to the 26th of November. You're listening to Reba Radio.
We've had a great hour with the science journalist and author Angela Saini with some historical background to and the implications of that today. And now we're going to be talking about impacts in architecture. And for that, she's joining us again live from the States alongside Lanre Gbolade of the Paradigm Network and Ming Cheng of Asian Architects. Welcome, all three of you, to Reba Radio. Lanre, if I can start by asking you to introduce yourself and what is your relationship with race?
Thank you. Pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you very much for the introduction, Marsha. My name is Lanre Gbolade. I'm an architect, co-founder of Gbolade Design Studio, as well as client lead for one of the largest housing associations in the UK, and co-founding committee member of the Paradigm Network, which very much looks to champion and support Black and Asian representation within the built environment. So my, connection with race. I am obviously a Black male architect, and obviously in the profession of architecture in the UK there aren't too many of us. It's great to be part of the conversation this morning, and hopefully I'll have lots of insight to bring forward.
Thanks, Lanre. Ming, same question to you. A little bit of an introduction to yourself, and what's your relationship with race?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's lovely to be here and amongst all the other people. My name is Ming Cheng. I'm a qualified architect, a qualified town planner, and urban designer. I have my own practice called Place Profile. We actually look at architecture and also city planning. I'm also a co-founder of the Asian Architects Association, together with Sumitra Singer and two other, and also Tumput Yasmin Fellow and Karl Mork and Minish Pommel. My relationship with race in architecture, probably a bit like Lanre, being a male and Asian architects, originally from Hong Kong. So I have a very, very different kind of special relationship probably to the UK, and just throughout actually studying and working in here, I actually just discovered, that obviously there's not being represented, and hence the AAA. And I also actually teach, at UCL, at the Barclay, and also at the LSA. So just would like to engage with the conversation, about representation, within our industry as well.
Thanks, Ming. Now, Angela, thanks so much indeed for getting up early doors to be with us this morning. Angela, one of the first things you said actually in our conversation that we played out a little bit earlier was that you're quite passionate about contemporary architecture. So rather than asking you about race, tell me about your love of architecture and contemporary architecture in particular. What's so special about it for you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure, especially to be alongside your two guests today. Many years ago, I did a fellowship at MIT, a science journalism fellowship, and we were allowed to take classes in whatever we wanted. So I took a course in architecture at MIT when I was there for those 6 or 9 months, because I have a love of contemporary architecture, like I say, and wherever I live, I like to reflect that love. It's not always possible to choose exactly where you would love to live, but it's one of my passions. I always take architecture tours wherever I'm traveling in the world, and I do think the built environment is so important in building your sense of self, how you feel about a place, and even I think it contributes to your sense of identity after a while.
I completely agree, and I have often said that the reason why I took this role is because I really believed that by influencing the creation of inclusive spaces, I could influence the creation of an inclusive society. Lanre, if I could come to you and ask you this very, you've alluded to it already, that there aren't many Black architects. Why is that?
When you talk about that not being many Black architects, obviously we're talking about here in the UK. That's the situation and the context that we're operating in, talking about. I think being quite open and honest. This is what this platform is for. The profession can be seen to be quite white and quite male and middle class, and the visibility of the profession to those who maybe don't fit into that category can be quite limited. So one of the biggest challenges, I think, for the profession is to reach those who are, yes, underrepresented in terms of groups, but also getting to those who are students, young students coming through the education system and giving them visibility of the profession, especially when they may have or they may not have social circles and family circles that are part of the profession at that period in time. So I think there's a lack of visibility to groups that are coming through from the younger ages of the profession and what it can hold, and the fact that actually architecture is something which impacts all of our lives at every stage of our lives as well. So it's something which we should all be able to contribute to, irrespective of race, background, gender, ethnicity, and obviously social class as well.
What was the difference for you when you decided that architecture was for you?
I was quite, I guess in some ways, always. I'd been brought up in a family that there were no kind of limitations in terms of what you could achieve. There was no curtailing of what you could aspire to be. All my family, our circles were very much people who kind of worked hard, professionals, those who were operating in whether it's medicine or law or accounting. So I was very much surrounded by those who were working in some of these fields already, but not architecture actually. I was given the license to explore and go as far as I wanted to in terms of looking at architecture as a profession, and I was always quite creative, quite open-minded, quite I guess observant and curious about the built environment and about society as well. So for me, architecture was something which I gravitated towards because I wanted to blend my appreciation of society, people, urban spaces with the technical and creative as well. And even though I didn't necessarily have architects in my sphere of influence or my family's sphere of influence directly, I was never discouraged, and I was always encouraged to pursue those ambitions. And that was because of, I guess, seeing people within maybe my own sphere of influence, in terms of family sphere of influence, who were doing similar things in other professions as well. So I think having that support and that network to kind of say, actually, okay, we're not necessarily architects, but we are operating in other fields, similar professions, then that gave me the confidence to pursue that, and I definitely wasn't discouraged anyway.
Ming, Asian architects, you yourself as Hong Kong originating, is there a sense that those from East Asia, Southeast Asia heritage have a particular experience when you're over here trying to be an architect?
Well, I think it's a very, I mean, personally, for me, is a very interesting journey, to me anyway, because being born and grew up in Hong Kong, it's a colonial, part of the British Empire, the remnant of that. And initially, when I was actually being like a lot of middle class Asian family, my parents actually worked in as a civil servant, so that is actually that is part of the reason why I can actually come to this country, is just because it's almost kind of part of the perks. But when I actually first came over here, that because I've been grew up in colonial Hong Kong, I always felt that I've probably feel more included, in this country because of, well, I actually see the portrait of the Queen every day when I go to school, or when whatever special ceremony, you always actually raise the British flags, and then et cetera, et cetera. So my perception was to say, well, I could quite easily actually fit in, and obviously the reality of that is probably very, very different. Probably similar to what Lanre has probably experienced, and I just find is particularly difficult. That very much like Lanre was actually saying, is there is actually quite a lot of students actually go in and study architecture, but when you actually get out on at the other end, is even when I actually start working, all these years ago, I just don't actually, I can't actually see any kind of role model. I mean, even now today, if you actually name me one Asian architect that's actually within our industry that that I can look up to, say, for any kid to say, well, I want to be look like him. And I think that is actually a problem that we have in the industry. And I always kind of say, well, surely we must have enough Asian architects or ethnic minorities, in this country to be good enough to be within the senior management role, to have much more exposure. And I think that's part of the reason why we formed the Asian Architects Association.
And when you say Asian, do you mean anyone from the continent of Asia, or do you mean someone who's from more Chinese or Japanese backgrounds, or what? How are you describing Asian?
Well, I mean, Asian as in the continent.
The continent,
so,
right?
But,
okay.
But particularly, even if we're thinking about, Far East Asia, or even in, let's say, in India or within that kind of continent, is still a complete lack of representation within our industry.
Okay. Angela, listening to both Ming and Lanre there, the word colonial came up a couple of times, and that sense of, that being a way that you feel like you could belong, and then coming over here and maybe not feeling that. To what extent does that really shape people's idea of identity, that colonial idea?
In the opening introduction of Superior, which is the book that I wrote on race, I use the example of the British Museum as a space in which identity is constructed. And this is true of national museums all over the world. Wherever you go in the world, you will see a reflection of what that country wants to project, both to its own citizens and to outsiders. And what's interesting about a lot of the architecture that you see, not just in London, but even here in New York, is how neoclassical it is. And the reason for that is because at that particular point in time, when these cities were, first being constructed in the way that we see them now, there was this sense that Western Europe was the heir to the Greeks and the Romans, and there were racialized ideas behind this, that these were the great empire civilizations, and now Britain was the great empire civilization, and the architecture reflected that. So it's built in to the environment, this idea that when you enter this space, you are entering the space of empire, and you should feel overawed by it. And to some extent, and myself included, I visited the museum a lot when I was growing up because I was Londoner and all school kids do. The way that each region of the world is segregated within the museum, and there's different ways to classify objects, of course, but the way that does it assumes that in each part of the world, everyone created and developed their technologies and ideas and everything else, art, separately. And it glosses over the fact that actually the job of building the world and creating things, the job of science and development, engineering, all of it is a global project and always has been. The science that is practiced in modern Western Europe began in Asia and Africa and Middle East and traveled, the medicine, maths, engineering, metallurgy, everything. But we forget that in the way that we divide the world up and then think about it in a siloed type of way, and then think about hierarchies between places. So you can see it for yourself in the style of architecture that has been chosen over the ages, the ways in which that reflects the racialized views of that particular place and time. And it becomes contested. When I lived in Delhi many years ago when I was working there are still arguments that happen over the parts of Delhi that were built by the British that look very neo-colonial. And, there have been arguments for decades over whether they should be torn down and something more keeping with Indian historical, traditional, ancient culture should be built in their places. That doesn't happen because they are very beautiful as well. But it's important for us to understand those histories and the ways in which they shaped not just how people thought about themselves in the past, but how, in seeing them even in the present, they influence how we think about ourselves now.
I'm joined by science journalist and author Angela Saini with Lanre Gbolade of the Paradigm Network and Ming Cheng of Asian Architects, talking about race in architecture. Coming up tomorrow, we'll have another day on CQ Knowledge, looking at the lived experiences of the underrepresented groups, socioeconomic diversity, LGBTQ plus lives, and 2 hours discussing disability in the profession with Shani Danda. All our content is being subtitled and made available on the Reba's YouTube channel under the Reba radio playlist. Angela's interview is available for a limited time only, so catch it while it's there. We're talking race in architecture with science journalist and author Angela Saini, alongside architects Lanre Gbolade of the Paradigm Network and Ming Cheng of Asian Architects. Lanre, I saw you really engage with what Angela was saying just there about colonialism and the way that kind of plays into architecture. What were your thoughts as you were listening to her?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting thought. I mean, I've actually started reading the book Superior in the last couple of months, and yeah, it really struck me actually, because I think to kind of start the book in terms of a bit of the introduction, Angela was talking about the idea of race being a bit of a social construct, which I thought was a little bit kind of mind-blowing actually, because you've never really kind of taken the time to think, actually, is this something which we as humans have conjured up, and we continue to perpetuate and reinforce it without really challenging it. And I guess in the last probably 18 months or so, since obviously Black Lives Matter, I think the conversation has come to the fore where people are beginning to understand actually there's a lot of history, a lot of things which we haven't necessarily questioned about race as deeply before, and especially for many of us in the UK, especially within architecture as well. So I kind of wanted to probably pose a question back to Angela and talk about that idea of race being a social construct, and what the last 18 months has done in your eyes in terms of the conversation, and what it maybe does going forward as well. Because I think some of the ideas you talked about in terms of looking at, artifacts and the composition of the British Museum, and how the narrative of global history is played out. How has that potentially changed, and how does it move forward positively to make the discussion about race on a global level a lot more inclusive and a lot more honest and transparent, and giving credit to the depth of history that exists in Africa, and the foundations of, I guess, civilization as well, that's emanated from Africa, but also parts of Asia as well.
That's a really good question. And I think museums, particularly over the last 18 months, have become a bit of a battleground for this conversation, because they do, not just in the way that they classify, but also in the objects that they have. Of course, the British Museum is full of objects that have been looted or taken or borrowed, shall we say, from other parts of the world. And there is a huge debate going on about whether they should be returned and how they should be repatriated. And there are other museums in other parts of the world in which that process of repatriation is already taking place. The difficulty here, of course, is the reason that these objects were taken in the first place is because, like I say, there were these ideas in the 18th, 19th, and well into the 20th century about racial hierarchy and civilizational hierarchy that informed who thought it was appropriate to take what they did. So if you go into the British Museum and you look at the Rosetta Stone, which is like a showpiece, one of the main, most beautiful objects in the museum, you'll see on the side of it, the British Army, when they took this object, engraved something on the side as a kind of claim it, which feels sacrilegious to us now, that anyone could even dream of doing that to an object that's so important and beautiful. But that was the way, people thought about these things at the time. And to some extent, when you look at the way in which the debate around nationalism and Britishness, especially since the Brexit vote has played out in the UK, there are still vestiges of that. There are still people who cling to this idea that the British Empire was a positive thing, that it was the moment at which Britain was at its best rather than at its worst. And there's a reluctance even in the government right now, of course, we can see that play out in the culture wars, to change that narrative of history, and to allow museums to tell it in the broader way that they should be telling that history. So I find it really disheartening. As someone who works with science and technology museums, for instance, I sit on the advisory boards of a couple of museums, and I find it really disappointing that this particular government has taken the position that they have when it comes to cultural spaces, to not say, yes, let's own up to the problems as well as the things that we're proud of. Let's embrace a broader and more honest and accurate version of history that really encompasses the whole world and sees progress as not something that was just confined to Europe, but as something that was happening everywhere at different points in time. And instead kind of reverted to this very myopic vision of history that does really no service to anyone, and especially in the internet age. I mean, you only have to go online to know the truth for yourself. Museums, I think, run the risk, and this government runs the risk, of preserving a sense of nationalism in its own imagination that isn't shared by everybody else.
Now, we don't have a representative from the government to rebut that particular point of view, but if you want to go online to find out the government's view on media and culture, please do so. Ming, if I can ask you, especially alongside this idea of having the Asian architects group, what is it that has compelled you and Samita and the others to have this group? What is it about the experience of Asians in architecture which means you've had to set up a group?
Well, I mean, first of all, is one of the reasons why we set it up is, Samita has actually done a tremendous amount of work, to try to have the kind of inclusivity of everyone. But I think it's just what we found out is the common perceptions, of particularly with Asians, that perhaps is just being unfairly kind of like stereotyped, and it just quite a lot of the common perception is just completely not true. That when being discussed, for instance, things about can leadership role, being promoted, to Asian, and the common perception is no, Asian they're just quite like just to be just do the work, they have no interest as being a leadership, in leadership role, they only just want to draw, or they only just want to do design, they don't actually want to entertain clients, or develop, or whatever. So hence the reason why we don't promote, Asian, at all. But that's just complete nonsense, because, well, if that is actually the case, there will be no architects in Asia. There will be no architects director in Asia, full stop. That is just not true, as well. And hence, that's the reason why we just want to start this conversation and actually say, well, you know what, Asian, we actually quite happily to actually go and develop and client development, or actually go and talk to the client and develop, whatever you actually need to do. I think one of the things that I mean, for me, anyway, is I find it quite astounding is, surely, we have lots of ethnic minorities, here, including, Black or Asian architects. And my argument is, okay, if you are actually not good in, if it's something that the ethnic minorities that we are lacking something to be promoted to be a director, either we're lacking something. So in that case, well, tell us what it is, and then we can go and identify it, and then we'll actually improve it. Whatever that we need to do. Do we need to play golf, or do we need to, do something else? Do we need to go on holiday, in Cornwall every year? That seems to be, one of the common themes, in there. Or otherwise, if we are not lacking anything, you can promote an Asian or ethnic minority architect tomorrow to be a director. Full stop. So what is it?
And you've got the Paradigm Network, Lanre. What are your aims?
Yeah, the Paradigm Network was set up in 2017 with 5 committee members, and our overarching ambition was really to provide, I guess, greater visibility of the great talent that exists within the pool of young, emerging black architectural assistants, architects working in the UK, and providing a platform that would give them visibility, that would provide them with opportunities, to develop career skills that would enable them to move up the ladders and see people who were like them doing that, however small. So we kind of came together with the ambition that actually we're going to take this issue of lack of representation and lack of career mobility from being a architectural assistant to being an architect, and stalling somewhere along the lines in terms of getting to, if you were lucky, maybe associate director, but really never making it to the very top. So we wanted to create something that would inspire, that would motivate, encourage, and provide, visible evidence that actually you, as a young black female aspiring architect, can get to where you want to be. Ultimately, I think what we've realized over the last couple of years is that we're not asking for anything other than people want to finish the race they've started. They want to get qualified. They want to be the very best architect they can be. And we thought actually we need a platform to really push this agenda forward and have difficult conversations, but begin to show people that actually, we're not asking for anything more than just enable people to be the architects they want to be.
And we'll continue discussing that actually specifically around, of course, it isn't the role of underrepresented groups to somehow fix this problem. It really is for those who have the power and the authority to be able to do so, to help out with this. So we'll continue talking about race in architecture with science journalist and author Angela Saini, alongside architects Lanre Gbolade of the Paradigm Network and Ming Cheng of Asian Architects. We're broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place with Reba Radio. So if you hear some background noises, there have been some people wandering around the bookshop and they're carrying out their normal day-to-day activities. So tomorrow we'll be here again, and we have another day talking about CQ knowledge. What do you need to know about the lived experiences from those backgrounds that are different to yours, as we explore socioeconomic diversity, LGBTQ plus lives and disability with one of the great activists for disabled lives, Shani Danda, who used to work for the RIBA, incidentally. If you've missed any of our live output and would like to listen again, you can. Stay tuned to this link, and all of today's content will be repeated after we come off air. Plus, we have my soundtrack between 5 and 6 p.m. Right now, we're talking race in architecture with science journalist and author Angela Saini, alongside architects Lanre Gbolade of the Paradigm Network and Ming Cheng of Asian Architects. And if I can come to you, Ming, that idea that actually, you're trying to highlight these issues of Asian lives in architecture, but it's not up to people from underrepresented groups to try to fix this. So what are you trying to do to push that agenda forward?
Well, I mean, very much like Lanre, we feel, as with anyone who's feel probably underrepresented, we just need to like to have a voice, and I think one of the way to do it is actually a group of people actually come together and try to create a platform and just say, well, actually, Asian architects, we are actually just as diverse and just as capable and just as, bright as anyone. And we're just going to try to, promote, ourselves and try to continue with the debate. And we will hopefully actually going to show, everyone else to say, well, actually, an Asian architect is just no different to any architects.
It's a little bit sad, though, isn't it, Lanre, that we kind of have to convince people that, just because of the colour of your skin and the way you might look, you're somehow still as good as? Isn't there something inherently wrong with taking that point of view? We're as good as?
Absolutely. I mean, let's look at it on a macro scale. In terms of the question about race, I mean, why are we even having the debate about, is racism wrong? That's it's a pointless debate that we shouldn't even be entertaining. But the reality is that we still need to. So it's a difficult one. I think, we need to be involved in the conversation. But you're absolutely right. It's not for us to solve this problem. We're here. We're present. We have the capabilities, we have the skills, everything is there, but there is a big blocker in the way, that there's a lack of understanding of people who are considered to be other. and the lack of willingness to really engage with them and see beyond color and see beyond difference, to understand actually there are people here of value, people who can bring something to practices, people who can add a lot of value to practices. And even if you were looking at it selfishly, you could say, you know, we can increase your bottom line, right? And to make you a profitable and sustainable business. But if actually, when you think about it, it's a lot more than that. You're bringing in people who have experiences, who have lived experiences, who have different backgrounds and cultures, and they can add a lot of flavor, a lot of interest, a lot of different ways of thinking about solving some of the biggest challenges that we're addressing in terms of through the built environment and society and everything else. So you're missing out on potentially a lot of untapped kind of potential there by ignoring that and looking at it just on face value, in terms of you're seeing a different color and somebody who maybe you don't think you relate to. So I think it's for business leaders, practice leaders, those in positions of authority and an ability to make change, to kind of say, actually, we need to address this here. We've got a talent pool here that we're not making the most of. We're not investing fullest in terms of potential, and we need to make a change and do that. And obviously that's part of the work that you're beginning to kind of really kind of motor on with, and I think it's much needed.
Well, thank you for that acknowledgement, Lanre. Angela, you know, what kind of solutions have you seen and heard of and would advocate in this area?
Well, when it comes to entrenched racism, which is what we're talking about here, you know, it's just fundamentally people believing that certain groups of people are different in the way that they think or behave, or what they're capable of doing. Then I think we have to dismantle the underlying ideologies behind this. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier, that when you have ideas about nations and national identity built on certain precepts, then it's those historical ideas that you need to revisit and bit by bit break down, where do these ideas come from, and how can we build a society with very different values that doesn't rely on these underlying assumptions. And that's a very slow process. It takes a very long time. I've been through it myself in the process of researching my work and writing my books. I've had to very slowly realign even how I think about myself and my own identity. There was this idea that I had for years, and I think it's because society kind of forces you into these boxes to think that there is something deep down that is Indian about me, because my parents were born in India, and it'll always be Indian about me, and it kind of shapes my character. Perhaps, you know, there's some kind of underlying subconscious idea that there was something Indian about me, and there really isn't. There is no kind of biological essence that leads to your racial identity. What this is just ideas that we have constructed. These are social constructs that we've built over many hundreds of years around social and political difference, that we've then imposed stereotypes on, layers and layers, which now we're living with to this day. The process of extricating yourself from that and extricating others, the way that you think about other people, involves really interrogating all of that bit by bit. It's incredibly difficult. It takes a lifetime. But I do see people doing that. Going back to what we were discussing earlier, that over the last 18 months, I've seen a huge amount of change in the willingness of people to do that, to revisit the past and think about their own identity in new ways.
The process of peeling back those layers and starting to get to the systemic nature of where this discrimination comes from, it does take time, but the impact for those now who are suffering now from discrimination. I mean, Lanre, what can we reasonably ask practices to do now, whilst they are also navigating the fact that we are in a society that is essentially racialized, to recognize that we're living in this racialized society and therefore try to mitigate the impact of that racialization?
Oh,
answer that one, Lanre.
exactly. Tough question. Yeah, I think let's start off with, let's start off with having those open conversations. I think you need to create conditions within practices for those conversations to happen openly, and know that there'll be no reprisals or any kind of sanctioning that happens because people are kind of talking genuinely and openly about what they've experienced or potentially what they've done in the past themselves. I think that needs to happen. And create conditions so that both members of staff and leaders can actually, look each other in the eyes and have, sometimes difficult, but much needed conversations. I think we've seen over the last 18 months that there have been a lot of exhausting conversations. I mean, personally, for ourselves as committee members of the Paradigm Network, we facilitated conversations between members of our group, and some of them, bringing forward a lot of years of turmoil and confusion and things that they've experienced within the workplace. They've all kind of come out to the fore, and it's been a weirdly therapeutic kind of process because you've now been able to talk about things you've experienced in the profession, racism that people have experienced, misunderstandings, and it's been therapeutic and in a good way, and also exhausting as well in the sense that why is it taking so long for people to really understand what it is that we are going through? So that's probably number one, in terms of creating the conditions for conversations to happen. I think number two is probably about leadership, and those practice leaders really kind of putting in place a strategy to look at how they're going to address greater inclusivity, greater equality, greater equity within their practices, and actually put in place a plan, a strategy, a roadmap to really integrate EDI into the core of their practices. I think ultimately it's about creating inclusive environments. And as architects, we should be the forerunners in that. We should be the ones who are really driving that agenda from a social perspective, economic, environmental, but we're about creating great places for people, and that starts in the office.
I absolutely 100% agree, of course. And certainly that idea that I always say there are three things you can do: listen, listen, listen. And there are three more things that you can do: is believe, believe, believe. Those people who come to you with their experiences. There is so much. This is why the CQ knowledge piece is so important. You need to surround yourself with that diversity of lived experiences and listen to those voices very different from your own, and understand that those perspectives are real and they're worth believing, and they need to be understood and acknowledged and internalized and reflected on, so that our practices and our industry and our sector can move forward differently. What is the Asian networks trying to push forward as well, Ming?
Well, I think as well as what we just discussed so far, I think one of the things that we need to do is for practices to actually go and do it. As simple as that. Because how many times have we actually seen events be related to race, or whatever that we need to do, and then afterwards we have all the practices in their social media network or whatever in the press, they all say we are an extremely diverse and very inclusive practices. We condone, we don't support any of that, and then yet you can actually just see it. You can say, well, we have a very, very diverse practice, and then you literally just need to go to their website and have a look at their leadership page. They are quite happy to actually parade all their leaders in there, and you suddenly think, well, you're not actually doing what you're preaching. So go and do it. And
it really isn't that hard as far as you two are concerned.
Yeah, and
it isn't. It isn't. I think increasingly more and more architects are beginning to kind of recognize that actually, if I want to work for a practice and invest my life, or at least part of my life in a practice, then I'm going to look very carefully about who I'm going to apply for. I'm going to look at what their leadership looks like. I'm going to look at the diversity of their staff members and say, well, actually, are they doing what they preach? And it's going to become more evident. The practices that are going to be, stand the test of time and kind of be sustainable in terms of, profitability, in terms of, continue to win work, will be the ones that are responding to this agenda. It's just like the environmental agenda that we're facing in terms of climate change. There's a racial change agenda that's going to be happening over the coming years, and the practices that recognize it and genuinely want to address it will be the ones who I think will be around for longer. and not just around just for the sake of being around, but actually being around, creating a great kind of practice, a great environment people want to work in and stay in. Because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the fact that people want to invest their lives in practices, because architecture is hard work. You know, projects take 3, 4, 5 years to complete. You want people who are going to be invested. And they won't be invested if they see that actually there's a very, there's not a glass ceiling, but there's a concrete ceiling. And I relate this a lot to the, I guess, the kind of the agenda that females have been facing as well in the profession for many years. It's very similar, females in architecture, females in construction is very much similar to the issue around, Black and Asian in construction or race in architecture. So I think, yeah, there's definitely still a lot of work to do, but I think those practices that don't wake up and almost smell the coffee will be the ones that will definitely be left behind.
Thanks so very, very much to science journalist and author Angela Saini and architects Lanre Gbolade of the Paradigm Network and Ming Cheng of Asian Architects. The full interview with Angela is available for a limited time only on Reba's YouTube channel. So head over there to learn from that and absorb it as soon as you can. And you can get hold of her books at the Reba bookshop, rebabooks.com/Reba-radio.
It's the Reba Radio Lucky Prize Draw.
We have 2 fabulous prizes to give away. Win a 2-night stay for you and a friend and or lover in one of Mallinson's gorgeous woodland tree houses. They are uniquely designed. They are funky. They are luxury. They are retreats. And they include fab things for a pampering stay. Hot tubs. Who doesn't love a hot tub? Saunas. Who doesn't love a sauna? Cargo net day beds. Who doesn't love a cargo net day bed, especially if it's suspended over a stream and it's beneath an oak canopy? Exactly. Woohoo. We can also win tickets to see the Specials live. Their show next July in Dublin. It sold out ages ago, but we've managed to secure 2 tickets for our lucky winners, plus a night stay at a hotel of your choice in Dublin, up to the value of £200. The date to hold in the diary is Saturday the 2nd of July at Trinity College Dublin. To enter the draw, you need to go to the Reba Radio webpage on architecture.com and just fill in the form if you're a member of the RIBA. And the magic word you need for the form is giraffe. Giraffe. You must put in that magic word into the form, giraffe. I know it's random. It's deliberately random. The winners will be announced live during the last show on Friday. Plus, each entry will receive a limited edition booklet, which is perfectly unique. It's striking, it's beautiful, it's got 10 top tips for inclusion, and it's an absolute must for your office wall. Full terms and conditions can be found on architecture.com. What a day. What a day it's been on Reba Radio. We've been exploring the lived experiences of women and racialized groups on day 3, CQ Knowledge Day. We've heard from Zaimel Azad of the Fawcett Society about the gender pay gap. We've heard from Dr. Annabelle Sowemimu about reproductive health, Claire Nash about work-life balance, Roma Agrawal, MBE, Farshid Misavi, OBE, and Melody Lung. They were all speaking together about their different perspectives about being women in the built environment. Ming Cheng of the Asian Architects Group and Lanre Gbolade of the Paradigm Network, and Angela Saini, the science journalist and author of Superior, The Return of Race Silence. It's been extraordinary. We've had some amazing, amazing personal stories, so much that you can learn from, you can reflect on, and really think about your CQ knowledge piece. Thank you so much for listening to Day 3 of Reba Radio. I'm Marsha Ramroop, the Director of Inclusion at the RIBA, and I'll be with you again tomorrow from 9 o'clock with more on CQ knowledge and the lived experiences on Reba Radio.
You've been listening to Reba Radio. Real, inclusive, brilliant action.